The forces of conservatism, it would appear, had triumphed after the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815. The Congress of Vienna restored conservative regimes in most of the states following the reorganization of Europe after Napoleon's defeat. Conservatism, in a way, became the ideology of the ruling classes in Europe in the early 19th century. It was an ideology of politics and diplomacy, which expressed itself more in terms of practical politics than in theoretical terms. In a way, the new ministers were not really new. Many of them were old and had been, in a way, the successors of the ministers of absolutism of the Enlightenment period. Metternich of Austria or Modulas of Bavaria, for example, had started their career under Joseph II or Leopold II of Austria, the enlightened despots. Conservatism, however, as recent historians have argued, was not a static philosophy. Conservatism was not necessarily against all change, yet the need for stability was so overwhelming that it tended to preclude possibilities of change through reform. The conservative order, as it was reconstructed after 1815, sought two things basically. One, to preserve the status quo prior to 1789, and this would have meant excluding all changes that the French Revolution or the newfangled ideas of liberalism, nationalism, or democracy had brought about. Secondly, they wanted stability and wanted to preserve the borders as they had been redrawn after 1815. There were two levels at which this was working. Internationally speaking, there was the so-called Concert of Europe. The Concert of Europe was the combination of the four powers, Austria, Britain, Prussia, and Russia, which created the Fourth Coalition to finally defeat Napoleon. The Concert of Europe had two basic planks, as it were. The first was the Quadruple Alliance, which was the alliance of all these four powers. They had decided to remain united for at least 20 years, even after the defeat of Napoleon, to prevent any recrudescence of the phenomenon of Napoleon or any upsetting of the balance of power. To achieve this end, they had decided to meet in periodic congresses to try and solve the problems as and when they cropped up. A second part of this so-called Concert of Europe was the Holy Alliance, which was proposed by the Russian Tsar Alexander. Alexander had proposed that all the states of Europe must conduct their affairs on the basis of Christian principles of love, peace, and charity. Obviously, this is not the stuff of pragmatic or practical politics. Indeed, it was described by contemporaries as high-sounding nothing and a piece of political, a piece of sublime mysticism and nonsense. But as Metternich had put in his memoirs, they probably tried to please the Tsar by signing the so-called Holy Alliance, because the argument was that no harm would come of it. But later historians, some historians, have reinterpreted the real intent of the Holy Alliance. They see in this the real instrument of intervention in the internal affairs of the various states which were experiencing movements for change. The Concert of Europe met in 4 congresses between 1818 and 23. The first was at Aix-la-Chapelle. At the Aix-la-Chapelle conference, they simply readmitted France as a full member of the European concert again. France had paid off the indemnity. The occupation army left France after the indemnity had been paid off. But while France was readmitted, the 4 powers secretly renewed their old quadruple alliance against France. So this is a very interesting part of the entire process. And the second meeting at Troppau, things seem to be stirring a little, particularly in Germany and elsewhere. The forces of change were astir once more, and this was a signal for the powers to try and do something. Metternich and the Russian Tsar were together in adopting what came to be known as the Protocol of Troppau. This protocol indeed authorized the various members of the concert to intervene in the internal affairs of countries if it became necessary. Metternich also used his personal position in Germany as the president of the Confederation to introduce the Kalber decrees, which sought to contain the popular movements which appeared to be burgeoning. The next 2 congresses at Laibach and Verona came in the context of more serious uprisings in Piedmont and Naples in Italy and in Spain. And now they had decided to use the principle of intervention without any qualm whatsoever. France sent an army into Spain to quell the Spanish uprising, which had earlier succeeded in securing the old constitution of 1812. Metternich sent in his army, the Austrian army, into Piedmont, Sardinia and Naples to quell the disturbances there. This, however, appeared to be the high water mark of the Concert of Europe. Already within the concert, there had been a difference of opinion developing, where England was on the one side and Austria and Russia on the other. While Austria and Russia wanted the concert to act as a dam against the rising tide of change, revolutionary change or nationalism, liberalism, etc. Britain wanted it to use rather as a sluice gate to allow a measured flow of change. This became very clear when Castlereagh, after the intervention in Spain, issued his celebrated state paper, in which he said that intervention in the internal affairs of other countries would be impractical and objectionable, and he wanted the alliance to be kept within the limits of common sense. Now this became increasingly clear as Greece started its war of independence against the Ottoman Turks. The Greek War of Independence continued without any intervention, though both Britain and Russia were keen to intervene here. When there was an insurrection for a liberal constitution in Portugal, Britain intervened with a paradoxical motive of preventing intervention. But what really sounded the death knell of the concert, as it were, was the promulgation of the Monroe Doctrine by the American President Monroe. He said that America is for the Americans. It was a warning against the Europeans to continue to intervene in America, in the American continent. Indeed, the Spanish colonies in South America, as well as Brazil, broke away from Spain and Portugal, and in spite of their best intentions, neither Austria nor Russia could do anything to intervene here. And after the Congress of Verona in 1823, the concert lost most of its purposes, and at least its organization. But what was an interesting experiment here was the attempt at supranational government. The concept, as it were, was seeking to act as a transnational organization that would have the right to arbiter the destinies of all the states of Europe, in a manner of speaking. Metternich had been the Chancellor of Austria from 1809 to 1848 and indeed has been widely claimed as the conservative conscience of Europe. He dominated the politics of Europe from 1815 to 48 at any rate, and was truly a minister of European conservatism. As the Chancellor of Austria, Metternich had the difficult task of presiding over a multiracial, polyglot and autocratic empire. This meant that the forces of nationalism and liberalism were virtually anathema to him. He was not expected, he knew that nationalism would lead to the liquidation of the empire, and therefore Metternich gradually adopted policies which were imparted a degree of rigidity to them, and there was hardly any possibility of change. Apart from Metternich's concern for Austria, he had the additional responsibility of Germany as the president of the Confederation. The Holy Roman Empire had collapsed after Napoleon's assault in 1806, but Austria was made the president of the Confederation of the German States in 1815. In Italy also, Lombardy and Venetia were directly ruled by Austria, and there were a number of Habsburg princes in the central parts of the peninsula. Metternich also tried to influence the policies of Sardinia, Piedmont, ruled by the House of Savoy, and Naples and Sicily. So Metternich's basic task was to preserve status quo, autocracy, and generally speaking, the old order in this vast and diverse part over which he had responsibilities. Metternich had his critics among contemporaries. Castlereagh of England described him as a political harlequin, and Talleyrand of France complained of his inconceivable superficiality. But Metternich had his supporters as well. Indeed, it is possible to see three distinct historiographical trends in the discussions about Metternich. The first of these was put forward by Metternich himself in his memoirs. In this, he tended to see himself as the savior of Europe. He claimed to have rescued Europe from chaos and disorder by some superb statesmanship. While there used to be a consensus that Metternich, in achieving or in implementing his policies, had virtually created a system, Metternich himself denied having devised any such system. He simply said that he had a Weltordnung, a world order. What he had done was to perceive this world order, which in his argument was based on deep and immutable laws. He had simply discerned these laws and tried to construct his policies on the basis of these laws. And here he had virtually created a structure that became very rigid to begin with. For him, the rulers are divinely sanctioned rulers of a kingdom, and therefore they must be suffered on pains of impiety or even blasphemy. He believed that the states are virtually the personal estates of the monarchs. People scarcely existed for him. Governance was the matter of the rulers and his ministers, and society does not require any other element of cohesion than a blind and total obedience to the monarch. He supported centralization and the autocratic structure of the empire. Or, if we may put it in another way, he felt it was his responsibility to keep this structure intact. Metternich drew his inspiration from reason. Burke, another major conservative, drew his sustenance from history. To Metternich, it was reason. Reason for him was a sufficient basis for his ideology, for his policies. He felt that the world had changed since the early modern period, since the time of the Renaissance and the Reformation. The invention of gunpowder, the Reformation movements, and the decline in the value of land as the only source of wealth had somewhat altered the society. Now, when he recognized this, he did not have any idea of how this would be changed. In his world, there was no place for either nationalism or liberalism, because nationalism or ethnic minority or granting rights to the ethnic minorities would have eaten into the centralized empire that Austria had been. And this is why he was obviously against liberalism as well. He didn't want change, he didn't want participatory governance, and he was against revolution. He denounced on revolution a wealth of metaphorical denunciation. Revolution was for him a volcano that must be extinguished, a disease that must be cured, a gangrene burned with hot iron, a hydra with jaws open to swallow the social order. So all this must be totally negated, and nothing should be spared to prevent revolution from coming. He developed his ideas and his so-called system in logical terms. The newfangled ideas, as we have seen so far, was totally against what Metternich could or could not do. And therefore, for him, the main slogan was govern and change nothing. This is the message that he sent to all his contemporaries, to the other rulers of Europe. Now, having looked at this historiographical position, we can suggest that Metternich had mainly three major objectives in what he was doing. He was determined to preserve status quo, whether of 1815 or of a period before 1789. He wanted to preserve the boundaries drawn or redrawn in 1815 by the Congress of Vienna. And third, he wanted to avoid war, and he succeeded in the last by and large. The Metternich system was at work first in Austria. We have to look at the internal policies of these regions to look at the working of the so-called system. Metternich wanted to first of all develop Austria as an ideal conservative state. There were two levels at which the system, so-called system, operated. One was the Council of Europe, which we had seen already, where Metternich intervened to suppress any movement for change, particularly any insurrection or uprising. Internally, he, as I said earlier, wished to develop Austria into an ideal conservative state. What did this mean? It meant the introduction of measures that actually approximated to what in modern parlance would be called a police state. Austria, as it were, was hermetically sealed from ideas coming into the empire. All foreign influences, ideological and otherwise intellectual, had to be totally excluded. A strict censorship system was introduced. The educational institutions were brought under control. The church, in such circumstances, always came in as a handmaiden of political conservatism. He also totally discouraged any increase in the self-image of the ethnic minorities, that they should not be allowed to develop an identity of their own. And therefore, he made one, and they must not be allowed to combine the different ethnic minorities within the empire, must not be allowed to combine against the centralized empire. And therefore, troops of one minority suppressed another. The Germans did duty in Czech-dominated Bohemia. The Magyar soldiers of Hungary, they did duty in Italy to suppress the revolutions there. Having tried to construct this ideal state in Austria, Metternich also had the responsibility over Germany. Germany was made into a federation of 38 states. Austria, as the 39th state, was the president of the confederation. Metternich gave the same ruling here, that govern and change nothing. He persuaded the King of Prussia not to grant a liberal constitution, but in some parts of Germany there had been, liberalism was a strong force. For example, in Bavaria, the regions that had been exposed to French influence for a longer period. But except in this region, the liberals drew blank elsewhere in Germany. But in Germany, the liberalism had a deeper root than in Austria. And therefore, in the years after 1815, gradually a liberal movement was taking shape. New newspapers or journals were being published. The Rhineland particularly was very active in this. Burschenschaft or fraternal society was created. Many Burschenschaften, many fraternal societies came up in different regions, and even a national league of the Burschenschaften of such fraternal societies was created. In 1817, they celebrated the 300 years of the rule of movement of Martin Luther and started the Word Book Festival. So in Germany, liberalism was proving to be a strong force, and Metternich suppressed them by introducing the Kalmar decrees. All the universities which were hotbed of liberalism were brought under control. Teachers and students were under strict supervision and surveillance. All mails were censored, even posts were opened. There was a central investigative commission set up at Mainz. Identical was the situation in Italy. Italy had a shallow base of liberalism, but Metternich introduced his system in all its rigor in that area. But while this developed, the Metternich system gradually broke down. The first reverse came with the breakdown of the concert of Europe. The second was the July Revolution of 1830 in France. Austria was not directly affected, but there were echoes of this in Italy and Germany, and Metternich had to send force to smother them. He had to accept the loss of Belgium. Belgium broke away from Holland and asserted its independence. Greeks earned its independence as well. Thirdly, in 1833, Prussia promoted Zollverein, which was an inoffensive customs union in which many German states ultimately joined, but they consciously kept Austria out. The Zollverein quietly worked for German unity, and in this unity lay one of the defeats of Metternich. This was seen more clearly 3 decades later. And finally, when the February Revolution came in France in February 1848, its echoes spread to the whole of Europe. There was a mammoth demonstration in Vienna, the Austrian capital. Metternich was forced to resign and flee to an exile in England, never to return to Austria. Metternich was a very significant and important personality in early 19th century Europe. He did dominate the politics in the first half, but In assessing his significance, we have to understand the limitations of Metternich. He created a system that was rigid. It had become a doctrine of pure immobility because govern and change nothing was his motto. He failed to conceive of an alternative. He had no vision of an alternative system. He knew that he had inherited a complex, decaying structure, and he only felt that his time was spent shoring up that ramshackle structure. In fact, he himself has said this: I was born either too early or too late. Earlier, I would have enjoyed life. Later, I would have helped in social reconstruction. Now my time is spent shoring up a decaying structure. This, we may conclude by suggesting, is an appropriate epitaph for a conservative in an era of change.